Hello everyone, I am Marcello Passarelli from ITD CNR, and my colleague Francesco Dagnino and I will talk about the literature review, which was one of the first steps of the Gaming Horizon project, which aimed at seeing what we already know about video games in the academic literature and just paint a broad overview of the topics that have been studied when talking about video games in the psychological literature, educational literature, and ethical literature. So we didn't go really in depth. Our objective was not to have a comprehensive analysis of everything that has been written about video games in the academic literature, but just to identify the main topics and themes that have been explored in social sciences literature. But nevertheless, we aim to do a systematic review of the literature. So we clearly recorded all the steps we took to recover the documents we analyzed. We retrieved the academic documents from two databases, Scopus and Web of Science, and we retrieved all academic papers which had a game-related keyword. So among the keywords that describes the paper, at least one keyword related to games, video games, gamification, RPG, and at least a keyword related to one of the perspectives we were interested in. So for example, for psychology, we collected papers that talked about immersion or collaboration, competition. We only collected papers from 2010 onwards, and we only collected articles, article in press, or books. So we didn't collect conference proceedings or poster, only the most established academic literature. And we only focused on literature in English. So the main problem we had, that was absolutely expected, is that we had too many documents. We are talking about tens of thousands of documents on video games. So our objective was to reduce this enormous amount of literature to just the few documents we could read to have an idea of what are the main research lines. And to this aim, we applied a filter based on citations. So we, among these tens of thousands of documents, we only selected those that were most highly cited, with the idea of finding the documents that were most influential in their field, most read, most talked about. And so we selected about 600, 700 of the most cited articles and books. And we read the abstract of all these documents to identify which were of the most interest for our project. So the ones that actually talked about video games, and with special priority given to reviews and meta-analysis, in order to have the most comprehensive view we could get without reading thousands of documents. And speaking of about the results of this literature, this here is a map of the keywords of the documents we collected. In this network, each node is a keyword. I know they are too small to be read, but and the edges in this network connect keyword that co-occurred in the documents we retrieved and selected. So if two keywords are connected in this graph, it means that in the papers we examined, they were talked about together. And by seeing which clusters these keywords formed in our corpus of documents, we identified several lines of research that we can consider to be the main lines of research in the psychological literature on video games. We can see quite a big cluster on engagement, so a lot of papers trying to find which features of a game make it more engaging. A closely related cluster on immersion, in light blue in this image, and another cluster on the health effect, physical health effect. A big cluster on addiction. This is a topic that is very widely discussed in psychological literature. And another topic that is very widely discussed is cognitive benefits. So do frequent players gain some kind of intellectual benefit from the frequent act of playing? So by reading especially the reviews and meta-analysis on these topics, we can see that first of all, immersion, which has been widely studied, is almost always studied in connection with the concept of flow, of experience of flow. So this experience of very high engagement and loss of the sense of time while playing. And this has been characterized in psychological literature both as a positive, because it's a very enjoyable experience and something that players look for, but also as a possible negative, because this sense of loss of time can lead to playing for longer than it was intended, and has been connected to the possibility of gaming addiction. Research on engagement, as I said, mainly investigated the features that help engage players in the act of playing, and especially how to determine the optimal challenge that results in maximum engagement. So to really engage the player, the game shouldn't be too easy or too hard, and finding the optimal challenge is considered very important. And also on those features of gaming that also lead people to play. So for example, socialization inside a video game. A lot of players report meeting people in games, and this leads them to continue playing or playing with their friends and using games as a point of connection with their friends. While studies on the health effects on video games also are about split between studies focusing on the most negative aspects, especially the fact that gaming is often a sedentary activity, so the risk of obesity and other side effects related to basically not moving because you're having a sedentary hobby. But also there are quite a lot of articles and studies on the positive side, health effects of video games, on Exergames, on the Wii Fit, and how games can actually motivate people to move and to exercise and to have physical exercise. Lastly, as I said, there is a lot of literature on addiction. This has been very, very widely studied. Sometimes some papers are actually critical of the concepts, while I would say that right now the mainstream in psychological literature is treating gaming addiction as a disorder. There are still some very influential articles that are harshly critical and say that we are pathologizing what's a normal behavior, and that some people just play a lot because it's really enjoyable for them. and we shouldn't be treating this as addiction. But I would say that the discourse is moving towards treating excessive play as a legitimate disorder. Regarding the cognitive benefits of video games, again, there is quite a lot of literature on it, and a lot of literature trying to determine what kind of benefits do people get from frequent play and how much these benefits generalize outside of the gaming context. And there is fairly good evidence that spatial reasoning especially is benefited from video game playing, especially action video game playing, and also reaction times, while the results on memory, for example, or problem solving are still a little more shaky, and it's yet unclear whether or not people gain benefits that they carry in real life outside of the games regarding these cognitive functions. And lastly, there is a lot of interest in the use of video games for rehabilitation, especially for older adults, and we are talking both physical and cognitive rehabilitation, so using video games to motivate and guide older adults in physically exercising and also in remaining cognitively active, for example in Alzheimer or Parkinson, using brain trainers and games that cognitively stimulate them.
As to the educational perspective, as you can see, the clusters of the keywords are not so well defined. There is an overlap among the clusters. And so finally we decided to organize our results on 3 dimensions that are the disciplinary viewpoint, the game viewpoint, and so we analyzed the research about the use of entertainment games, applying games, and gamification. And the last one is the learning impact viewpoint. And therefore we organized our literature about knowledge acquisition, skills acquisition, the topic of collaboration, social impact, and on behavior change. Under the disciplinary viewpoint, the literature review gave back a representation of the use of games, mostly in the field of STEM education, health in training for people working in the health sector, business, language learning, and economics. Similarly, gamification is spread in STEM and in computer-related disciplines, and the idea of researchers is that this happens because teachers in these subjects are more confident with technologies and so are more keen to use this kind of tools. As to the learning impact viewpoint, we got recent meta-analysis that conclude that digital games significantly enhance student learning if compared with non-game conditions. As I've told you before, we went a little bit into depth in the different kind of knowledge and skills. As a knowledge acquisition, what we got is that in randomized control studies, there is a positive effects of games. So in this field, they seem to work. As to skills acquisition, we got interesting results, as I told you before, in the healthcare sector and for communication skills. When games are used for 21st century skills, unfortunately, we have small studies and not so significant about the impact on 21st century skills and information literacy. So they are used but not so explored the aspect of the outcomes of this use. About collaboration, as for the other 21st century skills, we have a little known about the effectiveness of game in developing collaborative skills, but we know that collaboration in games have an effect on motivation and on learning outcomes. About social impact, we got from the literature initial positive findings in the evaluation of games that in some way address ethical issues. So games seems to be good for addressing ethical issues. Now we are talking about the game's viewpoint. As to entertainment game, the studies are related mainly on perceptual and cognitive skills, as Marcello has already told, and with positive effects, we know. They can potentially convey subject-related contents and can be relevant for social skills, but again, the evidence of outcomes is scant for this area. In the field of applied games, most of the research concern learning effects and are focused on knowledge acquisition or skills development and also on engagement. A particular attention has been given about the game-making approach that seem to work better for, again, 21st century skills. As to gamification, we got that empirical outcomes of the application of gamification in education are tendentially positive in terms of engagement and in terms of motivation, but the literature highlight also negative outcomes in terms of difficulty in bearing the pressure brought by competition, and according to some authors, the attention can be shifted from the learning objective to the game itself. So the conclusion is that more studies of the integration of game elements in learning environments are needed. In general, authors focused their attention in these last years to the relationship between game design, game attributes, or game elements and the learning outcomes. Here we are looking at the ethical perspective. As you can see, we have two big clusters of keywords. So we were guided in organizing our results from these two clusters. The green one is about violence and aggression, and the red one is about identity and diversity. And as you can see in my presentation, the aspect of identity and diversity was explored into depth, identifying some subtopics. The first topic I would like to treat is violent video games and player aggression. We have some literature reviews and meta-analyses. They gave us contrasting findings because from the point of view of some researcher, there is a link between violent video games and player aggression, but not only. Also, there is a link between playing pro-social games and pro-social behaviors. So games are able to, games have an impact on behavior. While other researchers deny this kind of influence. Why this contrasting findings. The problem is, could be, for example, at methodological level. For example, how in these studies violence is measured, who was involved in this research. For example, in one meta-analysis, the authors used the literature of every age, in the other, just literature about adolescent and young people. So this can create differences. And the problem can be also the definition of violent video games or violent gameplay. Because in these studies we have a wide variety of situations and games. And so this need probably more attention and other studies to have something conclusive. Some other key outcomes are, as I've told you before, that the pro-social elements and cooperative team play can attenuate potentially harmful effects of game violence, but of course there is a need of putting a greater focus on player motivation, player profile, and the context. The other big cluster is the one about identity and diversity in gaming. As we know, the archetypal representation of the player has been for years a man, white, and heterosexual. And literature, researchers has been trying to challenge this gamer stereotype. We went more into depth in different subtopics. For example, we analyzed the literature about gender, which is a topic that was explored a lot in literature. And there is a lot of literature about the underrepresentation of women in games and the stereotyped representation. But we can say that now the results give us back an idea, a better idea. Sexualization of female characters is diminishing. There are more female playable characters, even though not protagonists of the game. And what is particular is that this representation is more fair in casual games, probably because of the audience of casual games. As to the topic of sexuality, we collected a big study about the representation of contents related to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and queer. And the results of this study told us that playable characters related to LGBTQ are rare and secondary, and this kind of contents are not related to the progress in the game. The topic of race, we have very few studies in academic literature, so we can in some way speak about a bias in academia, because this topic is treated a lot in other contexts like press and blogs. And what we can say is that there is a low non-white representation in games, and especially in casual games. The issue of disability as well has little coverage in the core academic literature. What is available is mainly about the use of applied games to support the acquisition of knowledge, and there is something about accessibility. Last topic, not represented in the keywords, but that turned out to be important, is monetization strategies and arc design. And one recent academic study contrasts what they consider legitimate revenue-rising strategies, such as aesthetic-related purchases, and other strategies like pay-to-win and pay-to-advance strategies that are considered unethical. The good news is that we found that there is more than one academic framework for ethical and value-sensitive game design. The example here is the framework Values at Play, and the intention of the authors is to use this framework also to guide the curriculum of game design courses. Last point is the ethical affordances of games. As I've told you before, games are possible spaces for developing ethical awareness and ethics-related skills in players. So there is a potential in this area.
Okay, a couple final consideration on the literature review as a whole. This literature review has been a considerable challenge for the project. It was a necessary step for the project because we had to have an idea of what academia thought and studies about video games, and we needed to know what the main discourse was around video games. But on the other hand, we had an enormous amount of material to read, and we are talking about social science production on video games in the last 7 years, so of course it's a lot of material, and we had to find the right trade-off between having a picture that was as comprehensive as possible in the time constraints of the project. So we devised this strategy of collecting and reading only those papers we consider the most influential. And for this reason, this literature review should be considered just a very broad overview of what are the main lines of research. But by design, this literature review ignores more niche research lines and more innovative research lines. This is an idea of what's the mainstream in social science research in video games. Nevertheless, it has proven useful for identifying which were the main topic, the main issues, and the main challenges in research in video games. For example, it identified how the debate on addiction is still felt very strongly in psychological literature, and it guided us in designing the interviews we carried out as the subsequent phase of the project, and finding which topics we could should focus on during the interviews. Thank you for the attention.